here we're going to be continuing on with the female reproductive system. Right, in the previous video, right, we've gotten through the male reproductive system, you know, the different structures from the testes to the vas deferens to the seminiferous tubules, which produce the sperm, right, latex cells, all those different structures. Now, with the female reproductive system, right, obviously there's a fair amount of difference between the two. Right, there are some similarities in the sense that, right, both male and females have gonads. Right, in females they're the ovaries, in males it's the testes. Right, so when we look at, right, the pelvic cavity in a female, right, here's what we see. Right, we had covered this particular organ, this organ in the previous system. That was the urinary bladder. So above the urinary bladder, right, superior to it, right, this organ right here, that's something called the uterus. Right, that is the uterus right here. Posterior to the uterus, again, here we see the rectum. No, the rectum is not a part of the reproductive system, right, but just to kind of be able to place where it is. Some different structures out through here. The labia, right, the clitoris. Here again, for reference sake, here's the pubic symphysis. Right, so we're going to take a look at some different images, some different structures of this anatomy. And of course, we're going to be looking at the gross anatomic model of it. Here's the bladder. Here's the uterus. Uterus isn't huge, right? The uterus is, maybe the size of a fist, a little bit larger, right? So it's not a very large organ, right? Now during childbirth, or during childbearing, yeah, the uterus can grow to significant size, right? I mean, think of a newborn baby; they're way bigger than a fist, right? But initially, that's the size of what your uterus was. So, here's from a top-down view, right? So the first thing we're going to kind of get, and the first few slides, I've kind of flown through them. The next couple of slides is where we're going to start to get into kind of the detail of each individual structure. But when we kind of look where, right, the ovaries are, where the uterus is, right, we can kind of get an idea as far as the grasp or the location of it. Right here, we are looking from a top-down view. Right, so this is a superior view into the pelvic cavity. Right, we see all the intestines up and through here. Right here is the uterus. Now we can see a couple of structures. We see one here. Right, same thing. Those are the same thing. That's what's called the round ligament. The round ligament. Just like any organ, there's a variety of connective tissue which anchors it in place. That's in part of what the responsibility of the round ligament is to hold the uterus in place. Now, there's a few other ligaments as well. Right, the broad ligament. I'm going to show you on this side. If we just kind of look all, I'm going to kind of surround it here. That big broad sheet of connective tissue. That's the broad ligament. Over here, there's a lot more lines. It's kind of difficult to see. But this is the round ligament. This is the broad ligament. Next is something which is going to anchor the ovary to the uterus. That's right here. That's something called the ovarian ligament. Again, that anchors the ovary to the uterine wall. Right? Don't confuse the ovarian ligament with the uterine tube. They're very different structures, but they are close in proximity. So, if we take the uterus, take the ovary, take the vagina, cervix, everything, and we kind of pull it out, it's a little bit easier to kind of start to go over. Here's the uterus. Here are the ovaries out and through here. Now, how I'd mentioned there's the ovarian ligament, and to not confuse that with the fallopian tube. Right? The fallopian tube, uterine tube, oviduct, all the same thing. Right? All three of those are the same thing. Call it whichever one you want. Alright. So, imagine if I were an egg. I would be within the ovary, and I would mature. So what happens? Egg here dumps down into the fallopian tube. See these like little finger-like, or almost like feathers, whatever you want to call them? Those are called fimbria. They're literally like fingers, right? Before ovulation, it's a little bit more open. You see how these are not quite attached to the ovary itself, right? Upon ovulation, they actually close and kind of almost kind of encapsulate this part of the ovary to ensure that once that oocyte is ovulated, that oocyte or that egg is dumped directly into the fallopian tube. All right, so from there, right, as it travels down the fallopian tube, right, we can see there's a couple of different structures. Right, the infundibulum, that's the first portion of the fallopian tube. Right, think of a funnel. Right. Think of kind of like the triangular portion, the cone portion of the funnel. That's the infundibulum. Right, where the funnel then narrows out, that would be the ampulla. Right, so infundibulum, and right here is the ampulla. So as we continue down the fallopian tube, down, this very thin part right here, this is something called the isthmus. From there, that's when the oocyte is going to dump into the opening or the lumen of the uterus. Right? Could even call it the uterine cavity. The inner lining, the innermost lining of the uterus, is something called the endometrium. This is the wall, this is the layer which is going to thicken and thin depending on at what point in the cycle a female is at, right, in the month. Right, this is the layer. We'll talk about that later. This layer from here to here, that's the muscle. That's what's called the myometrium. The myometrium, uterine muscle. And the very outermost layer, right here, right, the layer which this light is shining off of, that's something called the perimetrium. So we continue down, we can see this thinning. I'm going to draw an arrow. Right, this thinning. That is the internal os, or the internal opening of the cervix. Right, the cervix goes from everything I just encircled there is the cervix. Right? This part here, that's the internal opening or the internal os. This here, right, this is the external os or the external opening. Then the middle portion, that's merely the cervical canal. And then down here, right, this is the vagina. Right, again, a little better image to be seen, but all up and through here, right, this kind of slit that we see here, this is where the opening would be. Right, this is the vagina. Right, so essentially the course and the way that, for instance, the sperm would travel. Right, let's draw a giant-sized sperm. Let's just think it was a big dude. Right. The sperm would swim up through the cervix, up through the uterine canal, up through the isthmus, up through the fallopian tube, into the ampulla, and about right here, right here is where the oocyte would become fertilized. All right, we'll talk more about that, but that's not something that can occur way down here. It can't happen down here. Excuse me. A successful pregnancy, right, fertilization can't occur here. It's got to occur somewhere. Smiley face. It's got to occur somewhere up in here. And the whole reason why is upon fertilization, so once the sperm and the oocyte combine, right, once we have the sperm and the oocyte, right, once they combine, right, that's called fertilization. In order for this, right, that fertilized egg, now what's called a zygote, right, in lecture we'll talk about this stuff. But it's not like it just, boom, as soon as fertilization happens, okay, it's ready to implant, or it's ready to be, right, dug into the wall. It needs days in order to prepare this. Just like the seed in a garden. You can't just go out and like throw a bunch of seeds on the ground and say, oh, it's going to grow. No, you got to prepare the soil, dig the soil up, get a hole for the soil, plant the seed, and cover the soil back up. Right? There's a whole preparation process which occurs. Hence the reason why fertilization has to occur somewhere in this vicinity, because it takes several days for that now fertilized egg to prepare itself for implantation into the uterine wall. If fertilization, let's say for instance, occurred way down here, after several days, well, several days, it's already going to be menstruated, or it's already going to be lost. That makes sense? Okay. So, a couple other structures that we see. Again, the fallopian tube we pointed out, right, the big broad ligament here, right, we pointed those out as well. Here is the ovarian ligament, right through here. All right. Now, this the oocyte, the egg. Right. Women are born with all of the oocytes they are going to have in their life. Right. They are the oocytes that you have as a woman, assuming you are a woman, right? For the remote couple of guys in the room. You produce those oocytes while you were still in the womb. Right, so when mom was still pregnant with you, right, that's when women develop the oocytes. Those oocytes are within the ovary. When, right, around the age of, right, well, 10, 11, well now it's, 10, 11, it used to be a little bit later than that, right, 12, 13, 14, right, when women begin to menstruate. What that process is, what's actually occurring there, is the maturation of these oocytes has begun. Right. So the reason why it's begun, in order for the oocyte to even potentially become fertilized, it has to mature. Right. So we can see, it's very kind of primitive, or it's very immature form. Something called the primordial follicle. Right, so, sorry about that. Anyways, the primordial follicle, right, when we think about the development of this oocyte in life, there's something called the follicle. The follicle is kind of like the wrapper, right, if you want to think of it like that. Like, think of a candy bar. Think of a Snickers. Oh, sweet baby. Oh, man, I love Snickers. Those are just deadly. But think of a Snickers, right, and then there's a wrapper outside of it. Kind of think of that as the same idea, right? Within the follicle, or inside of the wrapper, is the oocyte. Right? The follicle is not the oocyte. Now, I keep saying oocyte and egg. They are synonymous. They are the same thing. Right? So when I say oocyte or when I say egg, I am talking about the same thing. Now, just like what we see here, primordial follicle. This, again, this is in fetal development. Right? This is, right, as the, right, when in utero, right, when women are in, right, in the womb, the oocytes are all housed within primordial follicles. Those are very just primitive follicles, right? Primitive houses, if you will. The oocyte, at this point, is just simply called what's called a primary oocyte. Right? There's multiple steps along the way from that egg in its full maturation. Right, way over here. This is when the oocyte, this thing here, right, is fully matured. But along the way, right, it becomes what's from a primary oocyte all the way up to a secondary oocyte. So, each step along the way there's a hormone we've talked about before called FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. Oh yeah. Follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the maturation of the follicle. That in turn matures the egg. Or think about it. The oocyte is, or the egg, is inside of the follicle. Alright, so as the follicle matures, right, it goes from a primordial follicle in fetal development, even early childhood, then menstruation occurs, right, the ovarian cycle, the uterine cycle begins. So therefore, the follicles begin to mature into a primary follicle, and then thanks to FSH, those primary follicles develop into secondary follicles, right? And then from the secondary follicle, it develops into a mature follicle, or a Graafian follicle. That's thanks to FSH. That's something called follicle stimulating hormone. So a couple of things. Right. This here, this is all a mature follicle. Awesome. When ovulation occurs, so when the egg is flushed down the toilet, or not flushed down the toilet, but when the oocyte is flushed out of the follicle, right? Well, if it's flushed out of the follicle, there's now this kind of empty follicle. That's not of no importance, right? Which was horrible English. Right? Even though the oocyte has left the follicle, the remnant of that follicle, right, that's something called the corpus luteum. This is hugely important, massively important. Right? The corpus luteum is going, all of these, the follicle, right, the corpus luteum, these are going to actually produce various hormones. We're going to talk about those hormones in a little bit. Right? But again, just like FSH, as the follicle develops, the follicle itself begins to release certain hormones. Before we get into discussing which hormones and what, we're just going to look at the different follicles. Right? This is the primordial follicle, very, very, primitive, super immature, fetal development, right? When you're a fetus. And then here's the primary oocyte, right? The egg. The primary oocyte is going to undergo something called meiosis. Right? Meiosis. There's multiple steps to meiosis. At this point in the primordial follicle, right, the primary oocyte is in a very, right, one of the very first stages. We'll look at the stages in a second, but very early stages of meiosis. But that's not the point of what I want to look at. Right, if we look at, for instance, through here, surrounding this, we have these follicular cells. All these follicular cells. These cells surrounding here, called stromal cells, they all, as the follicle matures, will look at what these particular cells do. So as FSH is released from the hypothalamus, from the anterior pituitary, that stimulates the follicles. Right. Well, when we look, again, here we have primordial follicle, thin layer of follicular cells, right? These stromal cells surrounding out through here. Now we look at the primordial follicle as it matures. Now it becomes a primary follicle. Remember, primordial follicle becomes primary, secondary, right? Secondary, mature. But we can see we start to have this substantial increase in cellular presence. Right? These cells called granulosal cells, right? Surrounding the follicle on the outside, kind of on the perimeter, is something called the theca folliculi. We'll look at the importance of that in just a minute. Something called the zona pellucida, that surrounds the actual oocyte itself. The reason why that's important is because that's eventually one of the layers that the sperm is going to have to penetrate in order to enter into the oocyte. Remember the acrosome we talked about last video? That enzyme which is located on the head of the sperm? This is one of the layers it's going to have to penetrate through. Now, once we have a secondary follicle, you can see there starts to be kind of some preparation in order for this oocyte to be flushed. Something called the antrum starts to form. It's just basically a fluid-filled chamber. All right, so a minute ago when I had mentioned, oh yeah, your the oocyte gets flushed out of the flushed down the toilet. I don't want you to think it actually gets flushed down the toilet. Right? But what happens is the antrum, this fluid-filled chamber, when ovulation occurs, all of this fluid literally gets flushed out of the follicle. And that's what then causes the oocyte to, again, flush out of the follicle and be caught in the uterine tube. Another layer we see, starting to surround the oocyte, is something called the corona radiata. Again, the corona radiata, we are going to see that a little bit later on when we look at the mature oocyte. Right? When we look at the presence of the sperm and the layers in which the sperm have to penetrate. The importance of these cells, right? The stromal cells, the importance of these theca folliculi, right? These cells through here. As the follicle matures, right, it is going to produce hormones. So we can imagine how there's a very thin amount of follicular cells here. Right? They're going to produce a small amount of estrogen. Well, alright, now we can see, well, there's significantly greater numbers of these follicular cells, right, making up the theca folliculi. So now we have greater, let's imagine the red arrows represent estrogen. So now there's a greater amount of estrogen being released. As the follicle develops even more so, again, if the red arrows represent estrogen, now since the follicular cells have developed even more so, they produce even greater amounts of estrogen. At this point, this is where we have the mature follicle. Right? We can see the size of the antrum. Right? We can see how fluid-filled it is. So literally, as this, right, as ovulation begins to occur, all of this fluid flushes out of the oocyte, or I'm sorry, all of this fluid flushes out of the follicle and directly into the oviduct or the fallopian tube. Right, we can see primary oocyte here. Right, we can see right, the zona pellucida, this deep, dark, bluish, purplish line. This thin layer of cells called the corona radiata. Right, the theca folliculi. Right, the substantial thickness, being able to produce, since it's mature, it's pumping out even greater amounts of estrogen. Remember, the red arrows represent estrogen. Okay. So this is what it looks like. Right? It kind of looks like if minions were purple, kind of looks like a minion. Right? I don't know. Sorry if you don't have kids, you're like, what the hell's a minion? Right? It's a movie. It's pretty good. There's a whole bunch of them actually, but they're pretty good. Anyways, where we can see way up in here these primordial follicles, very small, and you can see as it matures into a primary, right, into a secondary. Right. Now, right here it's not fully matured yet. Right, we're still looking at a secondary follicle, but you can envision how this would then continue on and just grow in size as well, from the oocyte, as well as the size of the antrum, as well as just the overall size of the follicle. Right, but you can see the kind of maturation steps along the way. Again, same thing. Oocyte here, this kind of deep bluish line here, being the zona pellucida. This light blue here surrounding that, that's the corona radiata. All of this is just that antrum, fluid-filled antrum. So, this part here isn't so much, right, I'm not going to specifically ask you questions on this. I'm actually going to skip this for a second and go to this one. And either way, I'm really not going to cover this too much, but just the idea of something called meiosis. As that oocyte is developing, right, there's different stages of mitosis, right? Prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase. Right, those are the different steps of meiosis. So here's where it begins, and you can see, well, fetal period, childhood, no development. Once puberty is reached, that particular oocyte, which begins to mature, starts to continue on with meiosis. Right? Not every month does this happen. Right? For instance, like it occurs every month, but only to either one or two oocytes. Generally one. Right? Women only ovulate one oocyte a month. Right? So it's not like all of the oocytes undergo and continue on with meiosis every single month. No, just one does. The one that's going to mature continues on with it. Right? As it continues on with it, right, at the level of, again, right here, this mature follicle, as it's been ovulated, well, when that occurs, that's when meiosis has been completed, and that oocyte is now fully matured. So, right here, just to kind of have a little bit better of an image, right, here's the ovary. As it ovulates, right now here it's been separated so you can see it, but as the ovary ovulates the oocyte, it gets dumped into the fallopian tube. Alright, so that's just the oocyte. Awesome. Now, how I'd mentioned, somewhere along here near the ampulla, this kind of first third of the uterine tube, that's where fertilization has to occur if you want any sort of successful implantation. Right. The reason why, how I'd mentioned, the cell has to make changes. It's not just prepared as soon as fertilization occurs. Right? There has to be some sort of preparation in order to allow implantation to occur. Implantation is just literally where it kind of buries itself into the uterus But when the oocyte and the sperm link up, right, when the sperm penetrates the oocyte, it becomes something called a zygote. Right? This is when we have taken two separate cells, right, a sperm cell and an oocyte, right, one from the man, one from the woman, and we've combined them into a cell, right, being the fertilized egg. That's the zygote. Then over the course of the next week, you can see how that cell it went from two cells to one, right? The oocyte and the sperm, went from two cells to one, and then it divided. It becomes 4 cells. Then it becomes around 16 cells. Then it becomes from 16 to 32. Right? You can see things called a morula. A morula, sometimes it's called you might see it referred to as like a blackberry. Right? Generally, a morula has around 16 cells, right, in size, right, and it has kind of the appearance of a blackberry, right, like a piece of fruit, right, not a phone. Well, BlackBerry phones. Most people in this class probably didn't even know BlackBerry made phones. I had no idea. But morula, right, it has the appearance of a blackberry. Now, something called a blastocyst. This is when the cell, or not the cell, excuse me, when the development has occurred significantly enough. It's right around 32 cells in size. That's when enough change has taken place where it now has the capability of actually implanting into the uterine wall. Let's just imagine fertilization occurred here. That's a problem. Because it took from here all the way to here in order for that cell to be ready to implant. Right? If fertilization didn't occur until here, that oocyte, it wouldn't be a blastocyst until way down here, and then it's long gone. Right? It is far beyond any capability to implant. Right? That's why the range is as high as 24 hours, but really, right, there's only around a 12 to 20 hour window as far as the viability of an oocyte in a sperm. Really, 20 is pushing it. It's closer to 12, right? About a 12-hour window for which the oocyte and the sperm have to become fertilized if there's going to be a successful pregnancy. Right? So it's a very small window. And again, it's like from here to here. You're like, oh, and think of how small sperm is. Right? It has gone from the testes, swam through the epididymis, out through the vas deferens, down through the prostatic urethra, out through the spongy urethra, right, into the vaginal canal, swam up through the cervix, up through the uterus, out into the fallopian tube. Right. This thing has traveled, right, comparatively to its size. I don't even know what good example would be, but let's imagine if you walked the earth. Right, that's like the distance the sperm had to travel for its size, right, comparatively. So the fact that there's only a 12-hour window, think about it this way. There's such a small, right, there's such an infinitesimally tiny region, right, a few centimeters in length, that fertilization has to occur in if it's going to be successful. Right, so it's really, I mean, it's really fascinating. You just stop to think about it, right, how much of a distance that sperm has to travel. But yet there's such a fine line between fertilization being successful or it's too late. Really fascinating. Anyways, in lecture you guys will talk more about that here in lab. I don't want to perseverate on that. But in the fallopian tube, right, one of the things to think about, well, these cells, well, it's a cell. It's a living cell. It requires nutrients, right? Just like any body cell. It requires oxygen, glucose, etc. Lining the uterine tube, right, are a couple of things. One, there's all the cilia, which helps to move that oocyte and eventually that zygote down the fallopian tube towards the uterus. Within the wall, there are all these things called peg cells. These peg cells produce this nutritious, it's not milk, but peg cells secretes nutrients and nourishment for the oocyte and for the zygote. Therefore, it has some degree of nutrients in order to actually survive. Again, that's the peg cell, which secretes that. Here, you can see the cilia is a little hair-like structure which help move the zygote along the uterine wall. Same thing with the peg cell, right? Except it doesn't move it along; it just helps to produce this nourishment, releases nutrient secretions to help nourish